I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had faced family rebellion, public scandal, and private grief, but the evidence placed before him that morning struck somewhere deeper. This was not simply another palace dispute. Historic royal properties tied to generations of monarchy had slipped beyond crown protection, and a newly assembled evidence file connected crucial decisions directly to Queen Camilla. Charles did not shout. He did not summon anyone immediately. He simply stared at the pages, frozen by what they appeared to reveal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles turned another page and felt the weight of the discovery deepen. The Internal Heritage Review, a detailed examination of how historically important royal properties were protected, managed, and transferred, named 3 losses: an old hunting estate, a centuries-old lodge, and ancestral woodland surrounding a former royal retreat. These were not simply expensive pieces of land. They carried family records, ceremonial history, memories of earlier sovereigns, and physical links to generations that had treated preservation as a duty rather than a choice. The king understood exactly why that mattered. Once such places slipped outside direct royal protection, recovering them could become almost impossible. Charles reached the final summary and removed his glasses. He placed them beside the file with deliberate care, but the movement exposed how deeply the information had affected him. An aide standing near the doorway noticed the silence stretching longer than normal. The monarch normally questioned every detail placed before him. This time, he asked nothing. Meeting dates, approval chains, private recommendations, and amended protections were laid out in sequence, showing how safeguards had been weakened before control changed. Then one notation stopped him completely. Beside a recommendation linked to Camilla sat a warning that the transfer could permanently place the heritage sites beyond meaningful royal recovery. Camilla felt the atmosphere change before anyone explained why. Word reached her that her husband had received the completed review, yet no request came for her to join him. She waited, first calmly, then with growing unease. The queen consort knew silence inside the royal household could carry more force than anger. Nearly an hour passed. She asked an aide whether Charles had said anything about her. The answer was no, and somehow that absence of accusation frightened her more. If he had been furious, she could have defended herself. But she did not know whether he felt betrayed. Charles finally closed the file. He did not ask for Camilla. Instead, the king instructed his aide to bring William immediately. That choice changed the nature of the crisis in a single sentence. This was no longer only about a husband questioning his wife. It had become a matter involving the future inheritance of the crown itself. And when William entered the room and saw his father's expression, he understood that the real battle would not be over property. It would be over trust. Behind the language of estates, trusts, heritage protections, and ownership lay something far more painful: a marriage, a father and son, and a monarchy already carrying years of emotional scars. Charles was confronting the possibility that history entrusted to him had been diminished during his reign. Camilla was facing the possibility that her judgment had wounded the institution she had spent decades trying to serve. William stood between them, knowing neutrality might soon become impossible. William entered his father's private room and immediately understood why he had been summoned. Charles remained beside the unopened second folder, his attention fixed on the first report. The prince knew that crown heritage, historic property and traditions preserved for future generations, rather than treated simply as private possessions, carried deep meaning for his father. The king had always believed he was only a temporary guardian. Buildings, woodland, archives, and ceremonial places had survived earlier sovereigns, and his duty was to pass them forward intact. He finally looked up and asked quietly, "How much did we lose?" William hesitated. the answer was not measured only in acres. He explained that the 3 affected sites had been connected through old heritage arrangements designed to protect them together. Once one safeguard was weakened, the others became exposed. Charles listened without interrupting, but his expression hardened when his son admitted something else. Months earlier, the future king had questioned one proposed transfer. He had been told it was routine administrative restructuring, a change in how property was managed, not a surrender of its historic protection. Now he understood that explanation had hidden the true risk. Camilla sat elsewhere with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She had spent years fighting for acceptance within royal life, surviving criticism that would have broken many people, and slowly building a place beside Charles. That history made the accusation especially painful. If the public believed she had helped weaken royal heritage, the damage would strike at the legitimacy she had worked so hard to establish. When an aide quietly told her that William had been called before her, she stiffened. The Queen Consort asked only one question: had Charles looked angry? The aide paused, then admitted the king had looked more wounded than furious. Charles felt that distinction himself. Anger could pass. Betrayal was harder. He asked William why the earlier warning had never reached him, and the prince admitted he did not yet know. But there was one detail buried in the timeline that might explain everything. The first protective restriction had not disappeared during a crisis or emergency. It had been removed during an ordinary estate meeting months earlier, almost unnoticed. William leaned forward and told his father that if they wanted the truth, they had to return to that meeting. Charles slowly opened the second folder. Camilla, still waiting in another room, had no idea that the moment everyone had forgotten was about to become the most important moment of all. That forgotten meeting would become the point everyone returned to, because it was there that a quiet administrative decision first opened the door to everything that followed. Months before Charles ever saw the devastating evidence file, nothing about the meeting appeared historic. There were no raised voices, no emergency summons, and no sense that royal heritage was about to become vulnerable. Yet one decision taken during that private estate review would later be identified as the turning point. A restriction protecting an old royal lodge was removed, supposedly to provide administrative flexibility. At the time, Charles barely questioned it. Later, he would remember every detail. Charles had entered the Clarence House meeting, expecting another difficult discussion about cost. A private estate review, an internal meeting used to examine the condition, funding, and future management of royal property, had gathered advisors to discuss several historic sites that were becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. One item concerned an aging lodge that had stood within the royal estate network for generations. Repairs were mounting. Staff argued that removing an old protection clause would make alternative management easier without changing the property's deeper royal connection. On paper, it sounded narrow, almost harmless. Charles hesitated before giving any approval. He remembered visiting the lodge years earlier, when its importance had felt personal rather than administrative. He asked directly whether removing the restriction could ever allow the property to leave royal control. An advisor assured him that other safeguards remained in place. Camilla supported the practical argument. She told him that protecting heritage sometimes meant accepting uncomfortable changes before neglect became irreversible. The Queen Consort believed flexibility could preserve the building rather than endanger it. After another pause, the king allowed the process to continue. That decision looked very different now. The later internal review showed that removing the clause had not simply created room for repairs or new management. It had opened a legal and administrative route through which the lodge could eventually be transferred. And once that protection weakened, connected heritage holdings became vulnerable as well. Charles read the finding twice. Camilla's earlier words returned to him, but so did something more disturbing: a handwritten note from the original meeting. Charles stopped when he reached the margin. The note recorded that one advisor had specifically warned that removing the restriction could create a permanent loss of control. Yet that warning never appeared in the final briefing placed before the king. The documented account of the meeting showed the concern had existed. Someone had simply ensured it disappeared before the decision reached its final form. Charles asked the question no one in the room wanted to answer. Who removed it? The approval trail did not provide an immediate name, but it moved through correspondence connected to Camilla's private office. That was enough to change everything. The king no longer faced a bad decision made in hindsight. He faced the possibility that a warning had been filtered out before he could act on it. By the time Charles understood where the missing warning led, there was no longer any way to avoid the confrontation, waiting behind the next closed door. Charles did not summon a committee. He did not surround himself with advisors, secretaries, or lawyers. He asked for Camilla alone. When she entered, the evidence file was already resting between two chairs, and neither of them reached for it. For several seconds, the monarch and his wife simply looked at one another. Years of loyalty, controversy, sacrifice, and survival stood behind them. But Charles needed one answer before anything else. Had she known exactly what those changes could cause? Charles kept the room deliberately empty because this had moved beyond palace procedure. Before trustees, officials, or legal advisors decided what responsibility meant, the king wanted to hear the queen consort speak, without anyone protecting either of them. The heritage trustees, the people responsible for helping safeguard historically important royal property and ensuring decisions follow preservation rules, would come later. For now, he wanted the truth from the woman who had shared his private life through some of its hardest years. Camilla understood immediately why the file was there. She admitted that recommendations had passed through people connected to her household, but she insisted the goal had been preservation, not destruction. Several properties were expensive to maintain, some were deteriorating, and officials had warned that doing nothing could leave them unusable. She had supported changes because she believed new management could keep them alive. Charles listened, then slowly pushed the handwritten warning across the table and asked why he had never seen it. Camilla looked down. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She told Charles she had never intended for any historic property to slip permanently beyond royal control. The king did not raise his voice. That made the question that followed even harder. He asked whether intention truly mattered when the result could not simply be reversed. She stood from her chair, shaken and defensive, while he remained seated. Camilla insisted she had never ordered anyone to conceal objections. She had supported restructuring, yes, but she denied removing the warning or telling anyone to hide it. Charles opened the second part of the evidence file. A documented internal record showed that concerns about permanent loss had already circulated before one later recommendation, carrying Camilla's approval, moved forward. That changed the argument completely. The queen consort could no longer say she had known nothing about the risk. She could only argue that she had not understood how far the consequences might go. Charles stared at the page, then at her, and the silence between them became colder than anger. Charles finally ended the private confrontation with a decision Camilla had feared from the moment she entered. No judgment would be made between husband and wife. William and the heritage trustees would examine every approval, every warning, and every action linked to her household. The king would not shield her from that process. Camilla left, knowing the argument between husband and wife was over. From that moment forward, the machinery of the crown would decide what her actions meant. The next move did not belong entirely to Charles. A monarch can carry enormous symbolic authority, but heritage arrangements involving trusts, estates, preservation agreements, and future inheritance cannot simply be repaired through anger. William understood that immediately. When the evidence reached him, he approached it less like a wounded son and more like the man expected to inherit whatever remained. For him, the question became brutally simple. What could still be saved before another piece disappeared? William stood outside the first review meeting with the property list in his hands. The prince read each name again, slower this time, until one stopped him cold. It was connected to childhood visits, family gatherings, and memories that existed long before the current crisis. He circled it so hard that the pen tore through the paper. The estate trustees, officials responsible for protecting important royal property and making sure major changes follow established safeguards, were waiting inside, but he needed one more second before entering. This was no longer an abstract review. It was inheritance being measured against loss. William took his seat and forced the discussion away from emotion. The review separated private residences from formally protected heritage assets, places whose importance came from history, public value, archives, tradition, or long-standing royal use. That distinction mattered because a property could remain physically standing while its protections quietly disappeared. Administrative wording, management changes, and approval chains could alter control without any dramatic announcement. Charles had learned that too late once already. His son was determined not to let it happen again. Charles spoke to William privately before the next round of decisions. The king warned him not to let anger turn the investigation into punishment against Camilla. He still believed accountability had to be fair, even after everything the evidence had shown. William listened, but his answer was firm. The future king told his father that protecting the crown could not depend on sparing anyone from uncomfortable consequences. Charles did not argue. He simply nodded, knowing his son was now carrying a responsibility he himself had failed to catch in time. William then received the first real break in the crisis. A documented trustee review revealed that a fourth historic property had already been scheduled for restructuring, but the final approval had not yet been completed. The prince acted immediately. He ordered the process stopped and demanded that every remaining safeguard stay in place until the full review was finished. For the first time, the family was not reading about something already lost. They had saved something before it disappeared. That success came with a cost. Camilla was formally informed that her household would no longer take part in decisions involving historic royal property while the investigation continued. She read the notice in silence, fully aware of what it meant. The first property had been saved, but the Queen had just lost something equally significant: her influence inside a part of royal life she believed she had earned. The consequence arrived without ceremony. No public proclamation was required, no dramatic removal from a balcony or official event. A short internal notice was enough. Until further review, heritage decisions connected to Camilla's household would require independent approval. For everyone else, it was an administrative safeguard. For Camilla, it felt like something much more painful. Years spent becoming part of the monarchy had been reduced, in one paragraph, to a warning that her judgment could no longer be trusted without supervision. Camilla read the notice twice before placing it face down. The restriction was narrow, but its meaning was impossible to miss. She would keep her public duties, ceremonial role, and place beside Charles. Yet her office would no longer have independent influence over sensitive property decisions. Independent approval meant that outside reviewers would now have to examine major heritage changes before they could move forward. The Queen Consort understood why the safeguard existed. She also understood what people inside the palace would think when they learned why it had become necessary. Camilla stayed silent when an aide asked whether she wanted tea or company. She said she wanted the room cleared. The answer was calm, but the hurt behind it was not. For years she had worked to prove that she belonged inside royal life, not simply beside it. Now one crisis had turned that hard-earned place into something fragile. The loss of influence mattered, because it suggested the institution no longer trusted her judgment, in an area tied directly to history, inheritance, and the future reputation of the crown. Charles approved the restriction, even though it caused him visible pain. The king knew that refusing it would damage the credibility of the investigation William had been asked to lead. If he protected Camilla from the same safeguards being imposed on everyone else, the entire review would look compromised. Later, he passed the room where she sat alone and stopped outside the doorway. He wanted to enter as her husband, but as monarch, he knew even a private gesture of comfort could be interpreted as pressure. The evidence then produced a difficult twist. A documented financial review established that Camilla had received no personal financial gain from any of the property transfers. That mattered. The crisis was no longer about greed or private enrichment. It was about judgment, influence, and choices made despite warning signs. Yet the same record confirmed that concerns about weakened heritage protection had reached her office before the restructuring continued. Camilla could not call that discovery an exoneration. She had not profited, but she had supported decisions after risk had been raised. Late that evening, she made one choice of her own. The Queen Consort asked for a private conversation with William. No Charles, no advisors, no officials. The next meeting would strip away titles, offices, and procedure, leaving only two people forced to decide whether trust could survive accountability. No trustee waited outside with another file. No father stood between his wife and his son. For perhaps the first time since the heritage crisis began, neither could hide behind the institution. Camilla knew William had the authority to recommend permanent restrictions. William knew whatever he decided would affect his father's marriage. And yet the Queen surprised him by beginning not with a defense, but with an admission. Camilla told William she had supported the reforms because she believed some unused royal properties were becoming impossible to justify. Repairs were expensive, maintenance costs kept rising, and buildings with little active purpose were consuming resources that could have protected more important sites. The Queen Consort did not deny that she had pushed for flexibility. She said she believed restructuring meant better management, not permanent loss. William listened carefully. Crown heritage safeguards, formal protections designed to stop historically important royal property from being weakened or transferred too easily, existed for exactly this reason. Practical decisions could become irreversible once history was treated like ordinary property. Camilla's voice changed when she spoke about Charles. She said she had never wanted the king to believe she saw his family history as disposable. Losing influence hurt, but his disappointment had cut deeper. For years, she had fought to prove she understood the weight of royal duty. Now Charles was looking at her as though she had failed the very test she had spent decades trying to pass. William did not interrupt. He understood that pain, but he was carrying his own. William finally admitted why one of the losses had angered him so deeply. The prince spoke about woodland, tied to memories of his grandmother, a place connected not simply to inheritance, but to childhood and family. That made the crisis personal for him too. He told Camilla that history could not always be measured against cost, because once certain places disappeared from royal protection, no later apology could restore what they meant. Camilla then offered the step William had not expected. She would permanently withdraw her household from future heritage restructuring, rather than force Charles to defend her continued involvement. The Queen Consort said she would accept that consequence if it protected the monarchy from another crisis. William did not treat the offer as surrender. He proposed something broader. She would keep no independent authority over crown heritage, but stronger rules would also apply to every royal household, including his own. William took that framework to Charles. The king accepted it, because it replaced punishment with accountability, and made clear that no one would be above the safeguards. Camilla would lose influence, but she would not carry the entire failure alone. Inside the palace, a settlement had finally emerged. Outside its gates, The country was about to deliver a judgment of its own. When the Heritage Review became public, the story escaped the careful language of palace offices almost instantly. To some, it was about royal privilege and mismanagement. To others, it was about whether centuries of national history could be weakened through decisions most people would never hear about until too late. Yet the strongest reaction centered on Charles himself. The king who had spent much of his life speaking about architecture, conservation, and inheritance was now confronting heritage losses inside his own institution. Charles read the palace statement before its release, and knew every sentence would be examined. The announcement introduced stronger heritage protections, independent review procedures, and an end to informal household influence over major historic property restructuring. Independent review meant that sensitive decisions would now face scrutiny outside the immediate royal household before they could move forward. That mattered because the earlier losses had shown how quickly administrative changes could become permanent. It also signaled that the monarchy was choosing reform over silence, even if that meant exposing painful failures. Camilla understood that public attention would fall heavily on her. Some criticism focused on the decisions she had supported, while other reactions acknowledged that the crown was at least responding with visible safeguards. The Queen Consort entered the room as the first television coverage began. Charles did not switch it off. He remained seated while commentators questioned judgment, responsibility, and trust. She sat nearby and listened. Neither tried to soften the words. For once, the criticism was not something they could dismiss as distant noise. It had grown directly from choices made inside their own world. William felt the pressure from another direction. The prince had become the clearest public symbol of reform because he had stopped the fourth property from entering the same restructuring process. Yet that success carried danger. He knew that appearing too forceful could make the crisis look like a son moving against his father's wife. Privately, he insisted that the new safeguards had to be about the institution, not one person. That distinction mattered because reform would only survive if future royal households were bound by the same rules. Outside Windsor Castle, the public response suddenly became personal. A small crowd gathered near the gates, holding handmade signs reading, "Protect our heritage." One elderly visitor placed flowers beside the barrier, with a simple note thanking the king for protecting what remained. The moment spread through coverage because it captured something larger than anger. People were grieving what had been lost, but they were also demanding that history be defended. William's intervention soon changed the tone further. Confirmation that one additional property had been saved because he halted its transfer gave the public a concrete success to hold on to. The scandal was no longer only about failure. It was becoming a test of whether the monarchy could correct itself. Charles knew the final step could not be delayed. Camilla's responsibility, William's authority, and the future protection of royal heritage now required one definitive judgment. The evidence had been examined, the marriage tested, and the public verdict heard. Now only the king's final judgment remained. Charles began this crisis frozen by the possibility that pieces of royal history had disappeared under decisions made close to his own household. He ended it facing a harder truth. Preserving the monarchy required accepting responsibility rather than finding one person to carry every ounce of blame. Camilla had made consequential mistakes. Advisors had failed. Safeguards had proved too weak. Charles himself had approved changes without demanding enough detail. The final verdict therefore became larger than punishment. It became a promise that the failure would not be repeated. Charles approved the Royal Heritage Protection Framework, knowing it would permanently change how sensitive property decisions were made. The framework, a new set of rules requiring independent scrutiny before historically important royal sites could be transferred, restructured, or stripped of protection, was designed to close the gaps that had allowed the earlier losses. William would hold permanent oversight authority beside independent trustees, ensuring that no future household could quietly weaken preservation rules. That mattered, because the crisis had exposed more than one bad decision. It had exposed a system too dependent on trust. Charles met Camilla privately before signing the final measure. The king told her he accepted that she had never intended to damage royal heritage, but intention could not erase consequence. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the queen consort accepted permanent removal from direct heritage property decision-making. She did not argue for exceptions. She simply told him that if losing influence protected what remained, she would live with that price. For Charles, the words brought no triumph. They only confirmed how much the crisis had cost both of them. William received the final findings with a different kind of relief. The prince learned through the documented investigation that the lost sites could not simply be reclaimed by royal order. Yet preservation agreements had been secured to protect their historic character, public importance, and surviving royal archives even outside earlier crown control. The outcome was imperfect, but it prevented total erasure. William had entered the crisis angry about what had vanished. He left it with greater authority and a clear duty to defend what survived. Charles refused to let the final judgment become a public sacrifice of Camilla. The monarch accepted his own failure to question the original changes more aggressively and acknowledged that weak safeguards had allowed the damage to happen. That choice turned the ending away from revenge and toward reform. Camilla lost influence in one crucial part of royal life, but not her place beside him. William emerged stronger as guardian of the inheritance he might one day receive. Charles was no longer frozen by what had been lost. He had chosen accountability over denial, protection over pride, and permanent reform over private blame. There would be no final mystery, and no hidden reversal. The heritage losses had wounded the crown. Camilla had paid a lasting price for her judgment, and Charles had answered the failure by making sure the same mistake could never define the monarchy again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.